Vivek, I'm going to start with you, Raji. I'm going to end up asking you the same question. Hard to not talk about the commodity issues for chips right now. 90% of the world's neon apparently comes from the Russia-Ukraine region, a key part of making chips. How does the chip sector overcome this challenge and obviously the increasing cost from this disruption from the Russian-Ukraine war?
Sure, Frank. So, semiconductors have been climbing a wall of worry this year. There is a geopolitical conflict, decelerating global growth. The sector was, perhaps over-positioned, the end of last year. There is also the concern about rising capital intensity. The specific Russia-Ukraine issue in terms of the commodity aspect of it, I think that's actually a very small and manageable direct risk to the industry, because these commodities are not used to the extent that I believe consensus thinks they are. And the other issue is that these Russia and Ukraine are not actually big sources of demand for the semiconductor industry. So I think the direct issue is actually very manageable. The other issue, the other risk that can come from this is if there is a slowdown in the European economy, or if there are other supply chain snags, because Ukraine does produce a number of components for the automotive end market. Those can be issues, indirect issues, and important. But I don't think the direct issue from a semiconductor perspective is that big in the near term.
All right, interesting. Raji, turning over to you. I mean, he just said other supply chain issues. Supply chain issues have really been the big story, at least they were in 2021. Do you see those easing?
No, the supply conditions are going to continue to be very tight, most likely until late 2023. The capacity conditions are very, very lean. Most of the capacity constraints are occurring on what's called mature nodes, legacy nodes. These are 40 nanometer, 90 nanometer nodes for chips that are, for instance, IoT or Wi-Fi modules or power management. That's where we see the severe capacity constraints. And so the foundries are in a catch-22 situation. Folks like TSMC are going to be hesitant about building new equipment, new capacity to support these nodes because they have to recognize new depreciation costs. So they're going to be very hesitant about adding capacity. At the same time, there's such strong demand for IoT modules, for Wi-Fi, for sensors, for power management, that basically we're going to be in a supply constrained environment for the next 12, if not 24 months. And that's a positive backdrop for semis because the pricing environment is going to be very strong for semis. The demand is going to outpace the supply. The companies are going to have very strong long-term visibility. And there's very little risk of an overcapacity or an overbuild. So it's a strong setup for semis, and we think the sell-off that we've been seeing is currently overdone.
You know, Raji, sticking with you just for a second, you mentioned legacy nodes. Those are chips that go into things like manufacturing, medical devices, and things like that. With a lot of talk about reshoring and a lot of talk about realigning supply chains so more production is done domestically. Doesn't that reduction in production of legacy nodes hurt that effort?
Possibly, but the building, domestic semiconductor manufacturing, while it's extremely critical for the U.S., is going to take time for that to happen. I think what is happening is that there are foundries like Global Foundries, for instance, that just recently went public, or smaller foundries that are based either in the U.S. or in Japan or in other strategic locations that are building capacity for these legacy mature nodes. But the overall capacity constrained environment is going to be challenged, and the need to build a domestic semiconductor industry here in the U.S. Is very urgent. And I think this recent supply chain shortage situation we're seeing now, and in turn the price inflation, because the price inflation really can be directly tied to the shortage of chips, whether it's in automotive, whether it's in medical devices, as you mentioned, right, or consumer electronics.
Absolutely.
So it's critically important to build a domestic semiconductor industry here in the U.S., but that will take time.